So the question that faced most of the people who encountered Jesus as he walked around the hillsides of Galilee and by the Sea of Galilee, the question that most pressed on them was, who is this guy? What kind of thing is he? We sense in him something other or different, but the categories we have don't fully comprehend him. And what I want to do this evening is ask along the way, what are their categories? What kinds of samples do they have as categories that they might try to put Jesus in? You know that in Matthew 16 and Mark 8, Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" And uh, the disciples say they think you're John the Baptist come back from the dead, or Elijah, or one of the prophets. And of course, he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Messiah." But the prophet is what the disciples were sensing. We're going to look at three other types tonight that come up in the context of this latter half of what has been called the antitheses of Matthew 5, the places where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, but I say." You have heard that it was said, but I say. We're going to be introduced to three different other categories along with prophet that people had to size Jesus up and ask, what kind of guy is he? So, with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So, if this is familiar, you're in the right place. We are in week 3 of our 8-week series on a scholarly stroll through the Sermon on the Mount. And one of the categories for people to see around them, of course, was rabbi. Jesus was a teacher. Rabbis taught. Jesus talked in Old Testament terms. His Hebrew scriptures, the only scripture he had, which was a central consideration of the rabbis. So he must have at some time seemed like one. And we'll see this evening that he engaged questions that the rabbis were engaging, and he didn't sit at their tables with them. He sat sometimes at dinner with them, but doesn't seem to have studied in their yeshiva or been a part of their social setting other than as an outsider. But he must have looked a bit like one. The second category is revolutionary. Here's a bloody scene from the revolt of 66 through 70 CE as it's captured in art. And at times, people thought Jesus was going to come fully armed and turn the tables over on Rome. So some put him in that category. And then there was a third set, or a third kind of thing, that was relatively recent among them. Some of you will recognize this terrain, others of you not, but those caves in the side of the strata of the rock formations are caves from the Dead Sea Scrolls community, Qumran, called the Essenes in their ancient community. And this was a group that pulled away from society in order to purify their practices and beliefs because they saw society, villages, and cities as a poisoning influence, and so drew away, a thing that became later prominent in the second, third, and fourth centuries in Christianity as monastics went out solo into the desert because their society seemed so polluted to them. This was the instinct of the Essenes, and we have, of course, their writings from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so we'll see them intermixed in what we talk about tonight. So we are going to read the last third of chapter 5 with those three, but especially the rabbis and the Essenes, in conversation with Jesus and ask, would he have looked like those people? Would he have looked like a sectarian who wanted everybody to pull away into a life of purity and community? Would he have looked like a rabbi, a sort of upstart rabbi who was trying to crash the party? Would he have looked like a revolutionary? And all three of those will come into play this evening. So with that in place, a little bit more about the Essenes, because both both Josephus, who was the prominent historian of Jewish history in the first century, he was a well-to-do Jewish man who provided apologetic, which was a defense of Jewish practices, to his Roman neighbors, and generally gave a history of the Jewish people. And this was from a book called The Jewish Wars, where he is trying to relate to the Romans. We are not a warlike people, but we have had wars. You can see how they might be worried about a warlike people. So, in the midst of this, he identifies three forms of philosophy pursued among the Judeans. The members of one are Pharisees, of another Sadducees, and the third school, who certainly are reputed to cultivate seriousness, are called Essenes. Although Judeans by ancestry, they're even more mutually affectionate than the others. So Josephus, in another place, goes to a greater extent in describing them. But here, you can see that he's saying, here are some of our categories, here are some of our parties. There are Pharisees, Sadducees, two kind of learned sorts in the hierarchy of Judaism. And then there are these pullaways called the Essenes. Another admirer was Philo of Alexandria. In the century before, he's a late first century BC character who spills over a little bit into the first century AD, but he was fascinated by the Essenes. He said there's a portion of those people called Essenes, in number something more than 4,000, in my opinion, who derive their name from their piety because they are above all men devoted to, and I'm leaving men in because it's the translation of the original that I have for you and read, but above all people devoted to the service of God, not sacrificing living animals, but studying rather to preserve their own minds in a state of holiness and purity. And he goes on, but I thought we don't have time tonight to read all he says about them. We will get back to other things that Philo said about the Essenes that will help us when we get to certain parts of our readings for tonight. So, we are looking for what Jesus would have looked like to people. And I start then with the last two verses of the whole Sermon on the Mount. You'll notice it's chapter 7 and not 5. I go to that because this is going to be the narrator's summary of how Jesus was received. And if we're going to be thinking about how people were perceiving him, we ought to ask, what does the narrator give us to help us understand that? Last two verses of the sermon. And so it was, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes or their scribes, depending on how you translate it. By the way, our translators for tonight for biblical passages are the New King James Version people. You'll notice that they don't hold. They came a little too early to catch the wave of inclusive language for humans. So you'll see some exclusive language using man instead of man and woman, or brother instead of brother and sister, that kind of thing. But I bring them as our third translation that we've used. We've used the NRSV UE the first week, the NIV the second week, and now New King James this week. The first topic that Jesus takes up in these last four of what we've called the antitheses are, the first topic is divorce. Remember now, last week we dealt with the first two, which were simple quotations from the Ten Commandments. You have heard that it was said, you shall not kill, but I say don't even be angry. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say don't even lust. Right? That's where we were last week in the two first ones, and they were simple quotations from the Decalogue, from the Ten Commandments. Here we have our first part being divorce, and here's how Jesus speaks about it. Furthermore, Jesus says, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. And this quotes a Deuteronomy passage that we'll get back to. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Right? That's the simple statement from Jesus in this part of the Sermon on the Mount. Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce, is you have heard that it was said. But I say is anyone who divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Now, I gave you in the prep guide an article from Blue Greenberg that I found very helpful. The issues about women in ancient Judaism and their place as represented in the rabbis, their place as represented in the sources we have, come to the fore in the case of divorce, of course. Women could divorce in the Greco-Roman world. By Jewish law, women couldn't initiate divorce. It doesn't mean it didn't happen in Jewish communities, but they didn't have legal precedent from the Hebrew scriptures. And so this is put in terms of what a man could do um, to divorce his wife except sexual immorality, says Jesus, is committing adultery. And and so if this is Jesus' saying, he is quoting from Deuteronomy 24. If a man marries a woman and she doesn't please him because he's found something indecent in her, then he may draw up a divorce document, give it to her, and evict her from his house. When she has left him, she may go and become someone else's wife. Now, as many of you know, the vulnerability of a woman who had been tossed from her husband's house was considerable because women had very few means and even fewer noble means of supporting herself in an ancient economy. And so a husband who divorced and threw his wife out, evicted her from his house, would leave her at her own on her own to fend for herself. And the interpretation piece here is about the word something indecent in her. We get several translations of that. Some people think, some interpreters think, and the rabbis go long on this, as you would guess, that this word is saying what Jesus said, which is, except in the cases of sexual immorality, but the word itself has a much broader possibility. So it left the rabbis with a whole lot of conversation to have. And as tradition went and interpreted the passage from Deuteronomy, it got interpreted variously as to what could be the criteria for a proper divorce instigation. And so this is from Deuteronomy 22. In two cases, the law provided, and this I'm not quoting Deuteronomy. In two cases, the law provided that the husband shall not be at liberty to put her away all his days. That is quote. If he falsely accused her of antenuptial incontinence, in other words, he marries her, decides he doesn't like her, and lodges an accusation that she was immoral before he made the contract of wedding, or if he had ravished her before marriage. Those two were conditions on which a man could not divorce his wife. Right? In time there came others, but here is how it shows up as an issue later in the Gospel of Matthew. If we're in chapter 5, it's 14 chapters later that the Jewish leaders come to Jesus and challenge him on his view. We may notice that in the crowd that's listening to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, we started with disciples and we end with the crowd. Nowhere is it mentioned that there are Jewish leaders among that group. If you read the narrative in both Mark and in Matthew, the verse that I just read, the closing of the sermon, where it says, the crowd was amazed at Jesus' teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. You can imagine that having that kind of a reaction from the people would have been a buzz that then incited interest from the Jewish leaders, because it might eventually form a turf battle. Wait, these are our people, and Jesus is trying to take them away. So by chapter 19, the Pharisees have become well aware of what Jesus teaches, and they test him. Pharisees also came to Jesus, testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" Now, I'll get to it in a second, but the rabbinic context is two of the great worthies of Jewish rabbinic Judaism of Jesus's time were Hillel and Shammai. They are quoted more than any others in the Mishnah and the Talmud, the collection of Jewish sayings, rabbinic sayings from this time. So Hillel and Shammai had a strong debate on what the criteria for divorce should be. Hillel said, if she burns the toast, that's enough, right? He had exactly this kind of language. It is lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason, right? That's Hillel. Shammai, on the other hand, said a man cannot divorce his wife except for cases of marital infidelity, which is Jesus's tack, right? So they ask him the question, knowing that he's going to upset somebody in this answer. And he answers. He says, let's go to creation. God created man and woman, and they became joined together. What God has joined together, let no one put asunder. Famous passage, right? And the next word they speak is, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? So you can see this is a skirmish about the very same topic that Jesus brings up in chapter 5. And so Jesus says, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Right? So he sounds very Shammaic. He's put his money down on Shammai as opposed to Hillel. And now we're back to our question of what would people think Jesus was. He did parlay with the rabbis. He did enter their debates. He spoke to things they cared about. He criticized them as they might have criticized each other. So there's reason that people may have thought this is a rabbi. Now, if that's the sort of Jesus part of this, and his encounter with the Pharisees, I want to take you back a couple hundred years, 180 to 160 BC, when Ben Sirach was writing, and his Wisdom of Ben Sirach is one of the intertestamental writings, one of the sort of writings that happened between the closing of the Hebrew Scriptures and the opening of the New Testament. He writes, dejected mind, gloomy face, and wounded heart come from an evil wife. Drooping hands and weak knees come from the wife who does not make her husband happy. From a woman sin had its beginning, and because of her we all die. Allow now no outlet to water, and no boldness of speech to an evil wife. If she does not go to as you direct, separate her from yourself. So you can see that there was a strong voice for male dominance in this setting. There was a strong voice for men to have full prerogative. And we only have dots that we need to connect from it. But Shammai is a bit of an outlier. And that makes Jesus a bit of an outlier on this topic. The image on your right here is an actual divorce decree from the Geniza Egyptian dig, where a whole lot of manuscripts were unearthed. And so we have a very ancient bill of divorce. And it adds, to the two restrictions mentioned in Deuteronomy, uh, the Mishnah adds, and this divorce decree is just to illustrate, adds three others. It provides in the rabbinic writings. Mishnah is the rabbinic writings or rabbinic sayings from, say, 200 BC to 200 AD. That's rough. It provides that the husband cannot divorce his wife when she is insane, when she is in captivity, or when she is a minor, so young as to be unable to undertake or to take care of her get or bill of divorce. So the rabbis add three other reasons not, but notice they're nowhere near where Shammai gets. No reasons work except infidelity, and that's where Jesus goes as well. And it's worth realizing before we get to the oaths. It's worth realizing together two things. One, this is obviously a relevant topic for all generations since Moses, right? For all generations, this question of what is the permanence of marriage? What if marriages aren't working? And it is a painful subject for some right here in this room. What I'm doing, treating it dispassionately, is trying to give you the context into which Jesus' sayings came. And I'm also trying to show you that in that ancient context, there were some, like Ben Sirach, who were basically saying the women don't matter in this situation, right? There were rabbis, there were quote wise men in the period that we're dealing with, who essentially disregarded the plight of the woman altogether and made the man able to divorce for any reason and put her out, which put her at vulnerable space. Jesus, on the other hand, would have been a friend to women in this judgment because it wasn't easy among the people Jesus was forming for a man to put his wife out for any cause. Jesus was forming the community of his followers with a sense of how to support women in the marriage bond, how to come alongside women and give them less chance of being put out in a vulnerable situation of having to fend for themselves. So Blue Greenberg writes about this generally, and you can find many other articles. It doesn't surprise us because of Jesus's interaction with women in the Gospels, but it's worth noting. All right? So now, on to oaths. Oaths are the next topic that Jesus takes up, and here's how he takes it up. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it's God's throne, nor by the earth, for it's his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you can't make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one, or from the evil act. It's from the evil is the Greek. And so it's likely from the evil one. It may be, though, just from the evil generated in a person. Okay, if this is the statement, Jesus is going to do something that wasn't being done by many in his time, because oaths were a part of not just formal life, right? Taking an oath in a court of law, which would have been normal in their time, but also just the kind of oath where you say, I swear on my mother's grave, X, or I swear on the Bible, in the case of the illustration I had up a moment ago, Y. A way that people validate in social life, validate the things that we're saying. And it's not uncommon among us, and it certainly wasn't uncommon among them. Jesus takes it up and says, we don't do that. We just say yes and no and stand by them. And for us who don't live in the first century and don't frequent the ancient sources, it can be a little bit confusing why this is a deal for Jesus, right? Why is he doing this? Why is he getting rid of saying, "Oh, I swear on the," or to quote Prince's Bride, I swear on the grave of my dead father," right? Um, you can kind of tell when somebody is serious because the thing they're swearing on is important to them. But here's the context from ancient times in which Jesus was moving. This is uh this is him in Jesus in 23 of Matthew, and he is chastising the Pharisees. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, "Whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it." Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sacrifices the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that's on it, he's obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? It seems, and this is frequently in the rabbinic writings, we see discussions of vows in which it becomes clear that people were using vows to trick. They were saying, "I swear on X," but that wasn't the thing that if you swore on it, it was serious, and so they could get away with lying because they were swearing on something that wasn't classified as a binding swear on. Right now, it sounds strange to us, but you can tell the difference between people who put their fingers behind their back and cross their fingers, and people who say, "I swear on my car that I don't like at all." Whatever it is, we have forms of this dodge. It apparently was happening, and even among the rabbis, it was happening that there were classifications or hierarchies of seriousness about this, and you could use it as a subterfuge. You could use it to get out of telling truth. The other thing about it, and we'll get to that in this next one, Philo of Alexandria said, "That being which is the most beautiful." Now, Philo, I quoted earlier, I should tell you who he is. Alexandria, one of the most learned ancient Jews of all. Alexandria was a center of learning, and he fully imbibed the spirit of Greek intellectual life and read the scripture in terms of that and interpreted Judaism in terms of that, sometimes to defend the Jews against people who would persecute them, but often just because he was a curious guy who cared about what things meant. "That being which is the most beautiful," wrote Philo, "and the most beneficial to human life and suitable to rational nature, swears not itself because truth on every point is so innate with him that his bare word is accounted an oath." So the best people don't need to swear, don't need to say an oath, because people know their authenticity. Next to not swearing at all, the second best thing is to keep one's oath. For by the mere fact, and this is the problem Jesus may have with it, by the mere fact of swearing at all, the swearer shows that there is some suspicion of his not being trustworthy. Right? So Jesus saying, "Let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Just count on telling the truth," is a call to his disciples to be truthful. It's a call to them to be authentic and have integrity apart from any sort of language that's supposed to verify it, which some people were using as a dodge of truth and others were using because folks were assuming they weren't telling the truth unless they swore on something. He says, let's just say what's true all the time. So the value here, if the value in the first part was more of an equality in marriage, more of an equality between men and women than was in most of the tradition, in this second part, in this second saying, the value is simply truth telling. And here we get a little bit again about those Essenes, those Dead Sea Scrolls community people, because here's what here's what Philo says about them. The Essenes are devoted to the love of God and of a continued and uninterrupted purity throughout the whole of life. of a careful avoidance of oaths and falsehood, and of a strict adherence to the principle of looking on the deity as the cause of everything which is good and nothing which is evil. This is from The Good Man is Free. That's another tractate. The other one was from Philo's interpretation of Moses' Ten Commandments. This one is from a book called The Good Man is Free, and it's a philosophical go on how you get freedom, and it turns out you get it by being pure and good. Here he says the Essenes are doing this in spades, and one of the elements that he names is they are carefully avoidant of oaths and of falsehood. Their yes is yes, and their no is no. So now let's ask ourselves if the Essenes are known for this kind of thing, because Philo's writing even before Jesus is speaking, if the Essenes are known for this kind of truth telling in Jesus's area, Philo's in Alexandria and he knows about them. If they're known popularly in Jesus's space as being highly valuing of the truth, then it's possible some people listening on that hillside are thinking, "Oh, he's one of those Essene sorts," right? It's possible that he will be lumped with them, and maybe even people are thinking after the sermon he's going to go back out into one of those caves. So do you see, they may have associated, in their categorizing, they may have associated truth-telling with the Essenes and said, aha, maybe this guy is one of them. Do you see where I'm going with this? The third of our sayings is what's called lex talionis, a law of retaliation. Famously, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Gandhi said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. All you end up with is a bunch of blind people who can't eat corn on the cob. Um, the the passage is Matthew 5:38 through 42. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Right? And this is where a lot of people stop in the recollection of this passage. A lot of us think of it as the eye for an eye passage that then goes to turn the other cheek. But look where Jesus goes next. If the first thing is don't retaliate, in fact, let more happen, he then goes to if anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, so if you're taken to court and they're asking for your tunic, let him have the cloak, which is more valuable, also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, that would be a soldier who's mandating that this any Jew at the time could be mandated to carry things for soldiers. So, and if a soldier compels you to go 1 mile, go with him too. Surprise the heck out of him. Give to him who asks of you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, don't turn away. So I think a lot of us stop this passage right at turn the other cheek. And that's a salient picture, right? I put it on the illustration to introduce this third part. It's a salient picture, the turning of the other cheek, and it's been closely associated with Jesus, and it's been important for the formation of Gandhi's and MLK's and others' nonviolent philosophies and theologies. But it goes on and extends the logic of non-retaliation beyond answering those who hurt you to answering those who sue you, those who master over you as soldiers. And then it even goes wider than that, because there's no offense in the last one. Give to him who asks of you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, don't turn away. Notice how. If I get slapped on my right cheek, I'm going to turn and offer my left. If I get sued for a tunic, I'm going to give my cloak. If I get forced to walk 1 mile, I'm going to go the 2nd mile. But now it isn't. Nobody's forcing me. Nobody's hitting me. Nobody's suing me. Somebody just asks something. They need something. And I'm not. Jesus is forming people who will not turn away when that request is made. Now, we aren't going to show the passage, but the Essenes were known for a community of goods and taking care of one another with their goods in a way that looks a lot like Acts chapter 2. This also looks in some ways, this kind of giving over to those who need participates in that world. So again, we may have an Essene echo, but let's see what else is going on. So this is from the rabbinic writings, and it's a way of classifying at a time when it was they were no longer saying if somebody takes your eye, take their eye, because they had stopped that. Instead, they substituted money, financial penalties, and so one who strikes another must give him a selah, which was a small unit of money in the times. Rabbi Yehuda says, in the name of Rabbi Yosei HaGalilee, that he must give him 100 dinars, right? So there's a disagreement among the rabbis, but there is a cost, a small cost for striking another person. If he slapped another on the cheek, he must give him 200 dinars. So it's twice as much if you hit the cheek. And listen to this, if he slapped him on the cheek with the back of his hand, which is more degrading than a slap with the palm, he must give him 400 dinars. And this is from Mishnah Baba Kama, about the collection is from about 200, so maybe 150, 170 years after Jesus, but some of these sayings were live while Jesus was walking around. Scholars tend to think that the slap on the cheek that Jesus is picturing is the insulting one, the back of the hand one, because it's on the right cheek. And most of people are right-handed and they would have used the back of their hand that way. If that's the case, this was the worst kind of slap. And Jesus says, instead of exacting money, turn and offer the left. To part 4, which is, you have heard that it was said. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Sons in the New King James Version. I think if they were doing it today, they would make it children. So what has baffled some interpreters and baffles us every once in a while is, whereas we all know you shall not kill and you shall not commit adultery, and we even know the writing from Deuteronomy on the divorce, and we know writings in the Hebrew Scriptures about oaths, but it's hard, hard, hard. You can search all of Scripture and not find words that resemble love your neighbor and hate your enemy, right? The hate your enemy part is not there. Now there are places in the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament, where people hate their enemy and are commended for it, but it's never given as a way of commanding. So where does this come from? Well, it happens to come, at least at one of the sources, happens to be that blessed Essene community that we've been talking about, that Philo so loved and Josephus so loved, as great representatives of the best in Judaism. Let's see what they say. This is I'm gonna come back to this part because I want to isolate the first part, but I'll circle back to for he makes his sunrise. This is a writing from the community rule of the Essene community. It's a Dead Sea Scrolls piece. It gives us a great glimpse of what was important to them. And some of the things you'll find have great overlap even with the Sermon on the Mount. But take a look at this. The master will teach the saints. This is the leader of the community. who is sort of a stand-in for the divine presence. The master will teach the saints to live according to the book of the community rule, that they may seek God with a whole heart and soul, and do what is good and right before him, as he commanded by the hand of Moses and all his servants the prophets, that they may love all that he has chosen and hate all that he has rejected, that they may abstain from all evil and hold fast to all good, that they may practice truth, righteousness, and justice upon earth, and no longer stubbornly follow a sinful heart and lustful eyes, committing all manner of evil. He will admit into the covenant of grace all those who have freely devoted themselves to the observance of God's precepts, that they may be joined to the counsel of God and may live perfectly before him in accordance with all that has been revealed concerning the appointed times, and that they may love all the sons of light, each according to his lot in God's design, and hate all the sons of darkness, each according to his guilt in God's vengeance. So if you're looking for a place that Jesus may be quoting, the Essene ethic of loving the insider and hating the outsider, loving the children of light and hating the children of darkness, that seems to be at least part of what he might be drawing on when he says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Because it sounds pretty consonant with what I just read to you. And so, in this context, the group that Josephus and Philo advertise as the best in Judaism, the purest of all, is very sectarian, very insider loving, outsider, not just rejecting, outsider hating, right? The word hate is used in the last part of this scene from the community rule. So it matters that Jesus, whom, we've been tracking what people thought, how people would have categorized Jesus. And we've seen that he interacts with rabbis and he interacts with people who would think that he might be a revolutionary. He also says things that make him sound like a Qumran Essene sometimes. He says, don't do oaths, don't speak oaths, and they say that. He says things about what righteousness looked like that they say. And so Jesus might be looking like them, and then suddenly he says, love your neighbor and love your enemy. And they say, wait a second, this guy's not an Essene, because we know them better than this, right? So in that world where people are sizing him up, he kind of, in the old world, it would have been he's scratched the needle across the album, he's stopped the action and done something opposite of what they do. I say to you, love your enemy and pray for your persecutor. And then it goes on. For God makes his sunrise, you're going to become children of God, for he makes his sunrise on the evil and the good, and brings rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And so in his book, my Dr. Fodder, my main professor in graduate school was Wayne Meeks, and in his book called "The Origins of Christian Morality," he notices that Jesus often and Paul often say, "This is how we behave." There are others who don't behave this way, and he distinguishes the Christian teaching from other ways of being. Here, Jesus, who spent a lot of time recruiting and loving tax collectors and sinners, here he says, this is not the behavior this is a behavior that even sinners and tax collectors, they love their neighbor and hate their enemy. God is calling you to be more godlike and love your enemy and pray for your persecutor, right? So he's distinguishing himself from the Essenes. He's calling them to have a better comparative than what's on the streets. Everybody loves their neighbor and hates their enemies. I'm calling you to something larger, something that looks more like God. And so, as we come down the stretch in our time, we skip these because we just read them. These are the last words of Jesus in Matthew 5. If you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Oh, somehow tax collectors got done twice. I think Gentiles is the other one. I don't know how that got put. Anyway, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So what is Jesus trying to do? What would people have classified Jesus as? Well, he's got some things the Essenes have. He's got some things the rabbis have, but he enters both of those settings and corrects them. He says to the Essenes, "You're right about the love your neighbor thing. You're dead wrong about the hate your enemy thing." He says to the rabbis who say, uh, "Let a man divorce a woman for any cause." That's not so much how we do it. He says to externalizing people who say, "As long as I do the behaviors, I'm good to go." Nah, nah, not quite home yet. He corrects the people around him, and this is the source. This um, this integrity and authority, the voice with which he speaks, makes the claim in the last verse of this sermon that the people were amazed at his teaching, for he taught as one having authority and not as their other teachers. You can see in his voice as well as in the content of his sayings in this part of Matthew. You can see that Jesus enters these places partly to affirm things they say, but partly to reform the people who are off track, partly to call folks to a higher way of interacting with God and with one another. He would have been recognized as different, and they still kept trying to size him up. But he didn't look exactly like an Essene. He didn't look like a rabbi. He didn't look like a revolutionary. He just looked like Jesus. Eventually, they got around to asking, could this be God? Right? They backed into maybe this was God showing up.